This book took you 8 years to write, and I just consider it an incredible gift. And I ended up with a feeling of more like, wow, a memoir that was really authentic. I was wondering, though, in terms of your process, at what point did you, or just talk about process? It occurs
Of
to me
putting a book together,
you could have 2 books here, considering the number.
I think there are 5.
There are 5 sections, right? And I guess that too. It could be 5, let's say, chapbooks.
Well, I think in the beginning of this, I'm just speaking specifically of this book now, not in general about how to put books together, which is another subject and an interesting one. But I usually simply work on poems, whichever ones present themselves, until I have accumulated, and that's what happened with this book, enough so that the poems started talking back to me and giving me some idea of where I was going, which I tried not to know as long as possible. And it became, first I thought it was a very schizophrenic book and it was going in 2 directions. And then a third one came in and I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And then another one came in and I thought, I give up. I'm just going to write more and see what happens. And it took me about 5 years, I think, to accumulate enough to realize that, in fact, there were 5 different threads. And once I could point my finger at them and say, oh, there is a section of elegies for my mother. Oh, there's a section of poems that revisit bad things that happened in childhood and adolescence. Oh, there's this, there's this, there's this. And they distilled themselves into 5 sections. And I think that there are 4 that are clear. The last 2 are both what I would call Zen sections. But the first are, I divided those up, not after the fact, but as I was writing them, into poems that had a kind of beginner's freshness and admittance of not knowing. And those poems seem to me now both more naive and more profound than the ones that I could write after that. And then there were other ones in which I began, in the last section, I began to integrate the Zen training that I have back into the larger world. As my first teacher used to say, where do you get when you get to the top of the mountain? You go right back down and go into the marketplace. You go right back where you came from. You don't arrive at the high peak and just stay there. It's not what it's about. And so those poems in the final section try to do that. But in the past, my first 3 books, I think, were collections of poems that were written, or the first 2 were simply collections of poems that I wrote during those years. And then I shaped them into what I thought was a way that was invitational to the reader and showed them off. So I didn't put a fuchsia one next to a pink one because that would be clashing. I tried to separate them. I actually think of creating a book as arranging a show of paintings. Which paintings work well next to each other, which would be jarring, which would be confusing. You wouldn't put a little delicate sketch of a cat sleeping next to a huge abstract, splashy black, red, pink, yellow, Jackson Pollock type thing, and so on. But there was a book, the first book that I wrote, which took off without me, was The Ghost of Eden, which was the one I referred to a minute ago, my ecological diatribe. And I tried very hard not to write that book. I didn't want to write it for several reasons. One was that everybody was writing poems about ecology, and it just seemed like a cliche, the current fad. And the other one was that it was really painful to me because of my own having grown up in a wilderness area and subsequently having to watch it die, be spoiled and begin to die. And so I avoided it as long as possible. But finally I had to do it. And after about 15 poems, I said, that's enough. Okay, that's a section. Now I'm going to write about something else. And every single poem, no matter what it started out being about, would do a U-turn and just say, sorry, I'm going the other way. And I ended up writing a whole book of that sort of poem. And I've learned now to recognize that when an individual poem does that, when it says, sorry, I'm not going the way you want me to, that that's great, that's a gift, and I should stop pushing and listen. And so this book had about 5 different pushers going at the same time. And that's why I think it took me so long to figure it out.
That's as I was reading it, I was sort of stunned and confused as I sometimes staggered through the sections, and but it was a remarkable read, and I should be so lucky to have such homework again. One of the things that I bumped into initially in that first section, of course, was the incidents of the childhood sexual abuse.
Yes.
And there, I appreciated the spareness, although oddly enough, I realized that made it somehow more painful. This was no Howl. This is no Sylvia Plath, but incredibly effective. I'm wondering if you have any pointers, advice, whatever you'd like to call it, for other people who might be wanting to write on the same topic.
Well, encouragement, first of all. I first came out of the closet about what happened to me, as it were, when I was a child. I remember reading the first poems, some of which are in this book. A few are in other books, but most of them were concentrated here. I was at a small conference in Texas. There were maybe 50 people in the audience. And I took a big deep breath and said, okay, I'm going to read some poems about an upsetting subject. And just for the record, I was never raped or injured as a child. It was a kind of cheesy amateur photographer type person and also another person, and they were mostly just interested in looking and photographing, and nevertheless, not a good thing. And I was very little, 4, 5, 6 years old. And so anyway, I took a deep breath and read some of these poems at this conference, and afterward, out of an audience of roughly 50, 11 people came up to me, 10 women and 1 man, and said, it happened to me, it happened to my daughter, it happened to my son, it happened to my sister. And I was astonished. And it made me realize that I had a lot more company than I thought. And it was not just a weird, strange, terrible thing that had happened to me that I'd hidden for many years and been unable to talk about. And once it was out, it was just so much easier to deal with. And to find out that, I forget what the statistic is, I think they just changed it from 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 3 women at some time. And so there's a lot of company and a lot of support out there. And I think it's important to write about it if the poems are showing those, I call them pressure points, but that's not really accurate. If a poem begins to suggest to you as you're writing it that there's something more there, you have to pay attention. Otherwise, you're just putting a lid on it. And you don't have to publish it. You don't have to show it to anybody. But you do probably have to write it if you've been called upon by it, namely yourself, to do it. And once you've done it once, then it becomes easier to do it again. And I just think it's important in this age of Me Too to get it out there. Let's get it out there. Let's make it something that we all acknowledge and we all can talk about, and that it's not a big secret anymore. I'm very grateful to all the women and men who have come out and said Me Too in one form or another.
It also struck me reading that section, which was full of tremendous, childish fun, the missing weekly readers. What else? Just your emphasis on freedom and how children could sort of gallivant around the landscape freely in those days and were not sort of hovered over, at least many children, and the irony there in terms of what your freedom brought you on occasion.
Mm-hmm. Yep, true.
But that I think is maybe as a culture we were somewhat naive. Also wondering if you have any thoughts on, is there a division? Do you see any kind of dichotomy between making art and therapy, or is this just a
Well,
head trip?
I do, because I think that good therapy has to do with confronting yourself, which the creation of art also does. But I think if you're troubled and you need therapy, that writing poems is probably not going to do it. That there's a lot in the therapeutic relationship that really has nothing to do with the creation of art. It has to do with the excavation of the past and the making sense of it and the bringing it into your current life and sensibility in a way that's balanced and that makes sense to you. And the tragedy of people who need therapy who don't get it is that very often those things become embedded and they become like thorns or something under the skin that keeps working its way through but not out, and that it can cause a great deal of subsequent damage. However, I do think that the act of writing poems can be extremely therapeutic all by itself, because it asks you to look frankly at the truth, whatever that may be. And that's an assumption I make about the writing of poems. I assume when I talk to someone who's writing poems that they're interested in the truth and that they want to know what it is and that they're not afraid to articulate it once they have discovered it. And that in itself is therapeutic because it blows the darkness off the mystery. And the mystery is permanent. The mysteries of human life, I think, are permanent, and we will never get to the bottom of them. And no one will ever write a poem that shines light on everything. But a poem can shine light on something, and that is a very useful and valuable thing to do. Reading other people's also can be therapeutic in the sense that you see that mechanism at work. But I do think there's a distinction between writing poems, which aspire to be art. I mean, it is an art, and they don't call it the hardest art for nothing. The most difficult art. But I think if someone is writing poems for the sake of therapy, for figuring themselves out, that takes you only so far. Because after you figure out whatever it is you're puzzling over in yourself, what do you do with it? What makes it art? How do you transform that into art and make it something that everyone can have access to and find meaning in, not just you?
That final sort of transformational
Yeah.
step. Also sort of emphasize the mystery and truth that you talk about as being sort of the essence of writing.
I suppose it doesn't hurt if you're really angry at someone to write a very angry, mean, nasty poem and then throw it away. Or change the name of the guilty to protect them.
Oh, wow. I want to thank you so much. Would you be willing to read us the last poem in your book?
Sure.
138.
I know how to find that one. Fast stars. I love the way snow first sharpens the branches, then gradually, softly erases them. No, I sharpen and soften and erase them. I repeatedly forget that I'm God of this place. I once imagined nirvana lay just beyond the smoke and dark of human craziness, this wilderness of ruins, as if there were a border somewhere not far off that I would someday cross when it was time, and that there would be time. The fast stars rising from the fires I kindle and tend are all my own creation, as is this graffiti, which lasts no longer than perfume. The temperature's dropping fast, bound for below zero. Again, I've made it too cold for the animals tonight, too cold for myself. I'll camp here in the hinterland, just outside Nirvana. The deer will dig snowbeds. The otters will not fish.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
You've just been a dream. You're just on
Our pleasure.